Tēnā koutou, called Tracy Morison Aho. I'm presenting some results from a project about the politics surrounding the provision of long-acting reversible contraceptives, or LARCs, drawing on data from interviews with healthcare providers in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So, for those who might not know, LARCs are injectable contraceptives, IUDs like the copper coil or Mirena, and subdermal implants. So modern contraception has a contentious history, as across the world, family planning policy and programming has been intertwined with discriminatory notions of what kinds of people should have their fertility restricted, and a range of efforts to curb the numbers of certain groups. Today, the potential for coercion and limitations on certain women's reproductive freedom is explicitly recognized, as most contemporary family planning policies highlight that the goals of fertility reduction can only be achieved through voluntary, rights-based approaches. Yet, some scholars point to the enduring effects of the population control movement of the 20th century and identify an ongoing tension between family planning as an instrument for reproductive rights and as a tool for addressing larger social problems. As a result, contraceptive care in the 21st century has been marked by a curious blend of non-directive counselling, which seeks to emphasise patients' informed choice and autonomy, and lingering paternalism and efforts to persuade women to use high-efficacy contraception like LARC. In my research, I noticed patterns of talk in my interview data that seemed to echo this larger tension. So I have a few quotes. I'm not going to read them for the sake of time, but you're welcome to pause the recording and read them yourself. But the quote that I've chosen here epitomizes a pattern that I noticed in the data of this overarching tension. And here the midwife speaks about wanting to protect patients, but also being aware of not overstepping one's bounds and imposing one's own agenda. So she reflects on the roles of who decides what is in women's best interests, who is the ultimate arbiter of the decision around contraception. And she concludes that this should be women themselves, but at the same time expresses this worry that you really will hope that patients will make the right decision on what's going to protect them and be in their best interests. So we also see, as well as this tension, we also see that they're good intentions. So like Lou, many of the participants in the study expressed indirectly or explicitly the desire to uphold patient-centered care, to facilitate autonomous decision-making and empowerment, and really just to provide the best outcome for their patients. But as this quote by Kaya shows, there was constantly this pull towards the public health goal of reducing unintended pregnancy rates by getting patients to use high efficacy methods. So Kaya says, so it's selling, trying to sell more of the pros about it, LARC, than the cons. I'm always trying to be real open and honest, but try and push them more of a long-term contraception. So here she's using this language of persuasion and sales, of pushing and selling. And this was common in the data, and participants also referred to targets or goals for decreasing rates of unintended pregnancy. And this was really seen as a measure of success of contraceptive programs and of their own work. But then at the same time, we see Kaya referring to the need to be open and honest. And like her, most participants were aware of this potential to be cast as coercive. So this clash between rights and public health occurs in the context of uncritical advancement of contraceptive provision through institutional targets and standardized procedures, along with widespread support for LARC, to the extent that LARC are meant to be presented as first-line or top-tier methods in clinical guidelines, so promoted over other methods. So my focus is on this tension that's produced when the women's rights discourse clashes with the public health discourse and creates a discursive dilemma for healthcare providers. So this was most evident when participants spoke about patients that refused to use a LARC or wanted to take a LARC out early or discontinue a method or not use contraceptives altogether. And they ran the risk of being positioned as a bad healthcare worker in this scenario because they either had to compromise the ideal of voluntary rights-based contraceptive care by pushing people to make a particular decision, or they had to accept women's wishes and then they failed meeting the mandates of getting patients to use and keep using high efficacy methods. So they were struggling to position themselves as good healthcare workers within both of these discourses simultaneously. And the question then is, how is this discursive dilemma resolved and to what end? So I want to look at three ways that this dilemma was reconciled. The first is in what I call the creation of a scenario of agency without choice. So this happens when women's contraceptive use is normalized and constructed as the responsible and rational choice, and indeed the only choice. So this constructs a contraceptive imperative that we see here in Janet's response to what she does when a patient says that they don't want to, or that they want to remove a LARC early. And she says, you can't just not use anything. So the right to choose to use contraception is no longer simply an entitlement, but rather an obligation if women wish to be considered responsible citizens. So the discursive dilemma is reconciled by restricting decision-making to method choice. So this upholds the contraceptive imperative and allows women the right to choose, but without compromising that public health mandate. But it's a limited choice. It's agency without a choice. The second strategy was through upholding normative understandings of family planning. And in the quote, you can see that the speaker draws on a women's rights discourse to construct LARC use as liberatory and therefore in a woman's best interest. But at the same time, this talk about choice and empowerment is entwined with race and class-based norms that regulate reproduction. So we have this seemingly neutral public health goal of family planning, but it's underpinned by middle-class Western ideals that censure childbearing among young, unmarried, and poor women. And this allows health providers to moralize and monitor their reproductive behaviors. So those who don't comply with the contraceptive imperative are irrational and irresponsible and acting against their own best interests. And pushing or selling high efficacy contraceptives can therefore be construed as acting in these people's best interests, and further professional intervention is justified. And you can see in this quote that this talk is subtly intertwined with race and class markers. And this occurred throughout the data and has been seen in other studies as well. So the final strategy was the use of risk rhetoric, which rationalizes actions that could be construed as coercive by casting these actions as protective or in a patient's best interests, and medical professionals as best placed to make decisions. So this is, of course, particularly problematic for women from marginalized groups, given the associations of high risk with class and race, alongside historical injustices that have been perpetrated along these very lines. So in the quote that I've got, we can see that the participant speaking about the risk involved in allowing women to play a more active role in decision-making or more freedom to choose. And this was notable in relation to supposedly unreliable or risky women. So they were referred to as being at risk, but this was conflated with them themselves being a risk. So the use of risk rhetoric is a characteristic of the public health script. And it's common in talk about the potential to miss opportunities to provide contraception. And it justifies infringing on women's agency by pushing or rushing them as being in women's best interests. And in this way, reconciles the discursive dilemma. So my analysis moves us beyond intentionality to show how contraceptive agency can be limited, even by well-meaning providers, and that coercion need not involve overt force, but also arises from more commonplace limits to free choice. We can link the limits to contraceptive agency to taken for granted understandings of reproduction and family planning, which have class and race underpinnings, to risk rhetoric of medical legal discourse that creeps into policymaking, as well as institutional arrangements that discourage reflexive practice.